Joey only here up in Wells, BC, British Columbia, 3,935 feet above sea level. Today I want to talk to you about the slippery slope towards unspeakable disasters. This is the Bad News Show. Let's go. There it is. This is bad news. My God.
Falling out right now.
Anything could happen.
Get on!
Wow. I'll watch the video later.
Keep on going to the water.
They try mopping this. So that's why I want to spend some time today and look at the 2023 State of Global Climate that the World Meteorological Organization put out. That's from the United Nations. Talk about some of these statistics and where we think they're going. And look at some more recent statistics and see if that trend continues. So we'll start a look here at the key messages. First of all, 2023 was the warmest year on record at 1.45 plus 0.012 Celsius above the pre-industrial average. There's no reason to think that we will not have crossed yet further over that. Concentrations of the three main greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, reached record high observed levels in 2022. And data shows that the levels continued to increase in 2023. We're up over 420 parts per million for CO2 in the atmosphere now. There's no reason to think that won't continue. Ocean heat content reached its highest level in 65-year observational record. Meteorologist Mark Ingalls suggests to me that we probably won't cross that again this year because it was so beyond the usual last year that even though it will probably match last year's and not exceed it, that doesn't necessarily mean that the temperatures that we're experiencing right now aren't remarkable in themselves. Global mean sea level reached a record high. The rate of sea level rise in the past 10 years from 2014 to 23 has more than doubled since the first decade of the satellite record, which was 1993 to 2002. So we see that the sea level is continuing to rise, although currently, you won't notice it month to month. You won't notice it maybe year to year, but if you start looking 10, 20 years, you'll start to see. And that's partly why some of these hurricanes, too, that are coming in are having even more disastrous flooding events as they come in, because the storm surge is coming in just a little higher, and especially if it's coming in during a high tide, it's having more water to work with to push inland now. Antarctic sea ice extent reached an absolute record low in February of that year, of 2023. The annual maximum extent was 1 million kilometers squared below the previous record low maximum. So it broke the old record by 1 million square kilometers of ice that just was not there. Preliminary data from the global set of reference glaciers for hydrological year 2022 to 2023 show they experienced the largest loss of ice on record, driven by extremely negative mass balance in both Western North America and Europe. For example, glaciers in Switzerland lost 10% of their remaining volume in the past 2 years. Extreme weather continued to lead to severe socioeconomic impacts. Extreme heat affected many parts of the world. There is wildfires in Canada, you recall here in BC especially, and up into, even into the territories, up very far north, extreme fire behavior going on. Also in Europe and Hawaii, major fires. These fires led to loss of life, the destruction of homes, and large-scale air pollution. So these are compounding, and also compounding in when we talk about CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Also compounding now is the breaking down of organic material, and not just in the permafrost ice lost and these new lakes up there that are these big methane releases, but also in the outflow of very large river where alluvial sediment has been massing for a long, long time. We're seeing ocean temperatures now driving further decay of these this material that's been sitting there for a long time, and this will produce a short-term but very serious warming event. So even if we were to curtail all of our emissions right now, this would still go on for a while, and it would still lead to a rise in global temperatures for 30, 40, 50 years. Flooding associated with extreme rainfall in the Mediterranean from Cyclone Daniel affected Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Libya in 2023, with particularly heavy loss of life in Libya. Food security, population displacement, and impacts on vulnerable populations continue to be of mounting concern in 2023, with weather and climate hazards exacerbating the situation in many parts of the world. In 2022, the latest year at the time for which figures were available, atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases reached observed new highs. Now we have a new president who wants to just do away with any restrictions to burning of fossil fuels. Meanwhile, we have the Alberta government who continues to spend Albertan taxpayer dollars, scrap the carbon tax. The carbon cap hasn't really resulted in much change in the quality of life in Canada. It's a misnomer. Before 1990, we had 340 parts per million, maybe in the 80s, up to 420 parts per million now of carbon dioxide rate in growth. Methane, although for a short time stabilized, took a big jump up over the last 20 years, now up to its 1,950 parts per billion. Nitrous oxide concentrations, steady growth. We see all these trends growing with no signs of slowing down, no political will to want to change. Meanwhile, temperature continues to climb. Every major model showing, all sets of data showing, at least during the industrial area, we had these ups and downs. Some of this was because of volcanic activity that cooled things off for a while. Some of these spikes come from flurries of activity worldwide. In the industrial era, they're starting to burn a lot of fossil fuel, starting to burn a lot of coal, and we start to see that manifest as it builds up in the atmosphere. And levels off for a short time through the 40s, but then we see steadily since the 1960s the trend of growth in the global temperature up to now, where we saw 2023 be the warmest year on record, 1.4 degrees above what we consider pre-industrial average. Mean near surface temperature shows northern Canada being much hotter than usual. It was the place that saw some of the most substantial growth in heat and we saw that in the forest fire behavior, what happened up there in the Northwest Territories, how much of the boreal forest burned. That's because what we'd expect a normal summer to be and what they actually got was far and above. In fact, they were somewhere in the 3 to 5 degrees warmer on average through the summer of 23 than expected. Now, Europe was warmer than average. Everywhere pretty much was, except for maybe the very southern tip of South America, maybe a few parts around Australia and whatnot. Some of this is because of the El Nino. Yep, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. No one disagrees. However, there's areas of unusual warming in the North Atlantic that do not correspond to typical patterns of warming or cooling associated with the El Nino. These global temperatures over the past 10 years there were 1.2 degrees above the 1850 to 1900 average, making the past 10 years the warmest among all 10-year periods recorded on all 6 of the data sets. The ocean, it warms and cools much slower than air does. Air can warm and cool very, very quickly. However, the ocean takes its time in absorbing heat and releasing heat. 90% of the energy that's accumulated in the Earth system and the climate system since 1971 is being stored in the ocean. As energy accumulates in the ocean warms and global heat content increase. So the ocean warms the air, more or less, right? On the average. According to a consolidated analysis based on data sets, the upper 2,000 meters of the ocean continued to warm in 2023. If this continues, a change that is irreversible on the 100 to 1,000 year time scale will occur. We've seen a particularly strong increase in the last 2 decades. The climate change is underway. It's happening. It's happening right now. Meanwhile, you look at sea level rise, and we're now seeing a rise of 4.77 millimeters a year of ocean surface rising. That's almost 5 millimeters a year. So if you looked at how long would it take for the ocean to rise a foot at this time speed, 4.77 millimeters a year, that would take 63 years by my calculations. However, as we see, the trend is increasing with very few dips in the amount of rise that's being observed across the planet. And what does this mean? It means that 4.77 millimeters a year is not the rate at which sea level rise will continue in the next 63 years. That number will continue to rise. Therefore, 63 years would be conservative overestimation for how long it will take for 1 foot of sea level rise. The impacts are being seen in Polynesia, the Marshall Islands, places like that in the Pacific. It's being seen by stronger storm surges from hurricanes. Well, you start adding 1 more foot to this, it'll be an absolute disaster for all coastal communities, and it's not going to slow down after that. Ocean acidification continues to be a problem. We saw locally an improvement in Canada where we had really bad acid rain problem for a long time. As a kid in the 80s and as a teenager, I went to lakes where I sat there for a day and watched not one fish jump, and I couldn't understand why such a nice, clear, crystal clear lake could have no fish jumping. And then I found out that what the pH levels were. Someone told me, oh, that's a dead lake. It's been acidified by too much acid rain. We've seen some improvements in that, as there's been efforts to curtail emissions. Certainly things like making the superstack in Sudbury gave local benefits. However, it didn't necessarily result in overall an improvement. It just kind of put it higher into the atmosphere so it wouldn't have local effects in Quebec and Ontario. Sea ice extent loss continued in 2023. It was one of the lowest years on record. The Antarctic saw its lowest extent of the Arctic ice, this Antarctic ice. It declined to 1.79 million kilometers squared on February 2023, an all-time minimum from the satellite era. Slightly less than the previous record low set in 2022. There are two principal ice sheets in the present climate system. So we are still technically in an ice age. That's what's changing. This is the end of the ice age. That's what's happening right now. There's one in Greenland and there's one in Antarctica. The total mass balance of an ice sheet is the sum of three components: surface mass balance, marine mass balance, and basal mass balance. So surface balance is the difference between snow accumulation and meltwater runoff. So, how much is it shrinking and growing just because of more snow falling on top of it and contributing to it, but meltwater also running off from the ice sheet. So these factors that don't give a whole lot of change right now. Mass balance is the mass at the loss at the edge of the ice sheet from calving, becoming an iceberg, the melting that's in contact with the ocean. The ocean's a little bit warmer, so any of that ice that's touching the water is going to continue to decline. The Greenland ice sheet continued to lose mass in the year 2023. That monitoring period is from the 1st of September 22 to the 31st of August 23. Snow accumulation over Greenland still exceeds surface melt loss. So there's a lot of melt at the surface happening, but the snow is contributing to a positive there. However, it's not contributing on the whole. It was an estimated plus 317 gigatons below the long-term average, but well above the extreme melt years of 2011 to 12 and 2018-2019, years where we saw great amount of loss. The summer of 23 melt season was intense. There was major heat waves in July and August. Satellite melt images extent indicate the ice sheet had the third highest cumulative melt day area on record. One day where how much melted in just one day. Biggest one day observation. It was the warmest summer on record at Summit Station. That's 3.5 degrees warmer than the 91 to 2020 averages and 1 Celsius warmer than the previous record. Summit Station experienced melting conditions for the 5th year in a row. Ice core records indicate that significant melting conditions last happened in the 19th century late. Talking about glaciers now, the annual mass loss for Swiss glaciers in 2023 was the second largest on record from 1950 to the present. 4.4% of the remaining ice volume disappeared. Together with the record mass loss in 2021 and 22 of 5.9%, 6% of the glacier lost, Swiss glaciers have now lost 10% of the remaining volume in just the last 2 years. That was driven by low snowpacks and warm summers. North America, it was particularly disastrous for the glaciers, who had the record mass loss in 2023. LiDAR stations showed that 3.5 meters was lost in some of these, and you can see that here in this image right here. This image is showing elevation change, and we can see a negative. So we had a below winter snowpack, which I think will change this year. That's good. We need the snow. We need the snow in BC big time now. It's really important. We had an intense spring heat wave in 2023, if you recall. That's when the fires started, for example, in the BC Northeast in the Peace, these major fires that burnt up 1 million hectares and more. That continued into Alberta, big fires in Alberta that started in 2023 in May. We saw big fires through the summer up in the Northwest Territories, for example. Some of this smoke landed on the glaciers and, little particles of dust and blackened them and even contributed to the sun having more radiant power on the glacier. You wear black, and what happens? You get warmer, right? Seasonal snow cover in the northern hemisphere experienced a long-term decline in late spring and summer. The northern hemisphere's snow cover extent for May was the 8th lowest on record between 1967 and 2023. And why is this important? Well, we need water in the system. It's really important. And what's happening is we get too much or too little, right? It's like flood or famine. And it blows my mind that Alberta, as it's losing its glaciers, continues to want to push this agenda of fossil fuels, knowing that they need the water from those glaciers in order to have a farming economy and even to get the fossil fuels out of the ground. They need that water, and the water sources are going to start drying up more and more. And you're on the dry side of the Rockies, Alberta. You're not going to get precipitation to make up for that ice loss in the long term. Warm air holds more moisture. That's a simple fact of physics. And that's why when the warmer it is, the more you're going to see higher precipitation totals. Regions with a marked rainfall deficit included Southeast Asia, the Amazon, and much of Central America, Southern Canada, the Western Mediterranean region and Southwest Europe, parts of Northwest Central and Southern Africa, parts of Central Asia, the Eastern Indian monsoon region experienced less than they want. Not good. And this also included coastal North Australia and many of the Pacific Islands. The onset of the West African monsoon was about normal. The Greater Horn of Africa region experienced a long-term drought, but it then suffered substantial flooding in 2023, particularly the later in the year as heavy rains associated with El Nino became established. Okay, it's a weather channel here, so let's talk about the difference between climate and weather. Neil deGrasse Tyson, in his wonderful series Cosmos back in the day, put out this great example, and it showed this guy. He's walking on a beach, and you can see his footprints in the sand. And that guy walking, he is climate. He's going where he's going. He's got with him a dog, and it's on a very short leash. The leash and the dog being weather, and the weather goes this way, and it goes that way, and it goes this way, and it goes that way, and that's the climate. The weather can only go where the climate allows it to, and he's going this direction. But eventually he clicks that button on his little leash thing, and the dog goes out a little further until he's going really far out, and it keeps going further and further and further and further, and the dog can do more and more wild things, can go further and further extreme. He might be able to reach the water over there and splash it. He might be able to go and touch somebody over there and bother them in the beach. He's going back and forth, and how do you rein that dog back in? So let's talk about the dog. Extreme weather continued to lead to severe socioeconomic impacts. This is a big one I want to talk about too. Extreme heat affected parts of the world. We had wildfires in Canada, Europe, and Hawaii that led to loss of life, destruction of homes, flooding with extreme rainfall in the Mediterranean. Cyclone Daniel affected Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey. A lot of people died in Libya. That's one of the most significant weather-related events in terms of loss of life that year was the cyclone in the Mediterranean, locally referred to as Storm Daniel, in September. Cyclone, we're talking about a mid-latitude cyclone, not a hurricane. In its initial stages, the storm produced extreme rainfall in southern Bulgaria, Greece, and parts of Turkey. At the same time, it made another storm system, which produced significant flash flooding in Spain, with adverse effects on cereal production. The heaviest falls were in the Thessaly regions of Greece. They had 760 millimeters fall there, 1,000 over a 5-day total, and 1,096 millimeters between the 4th and 8th of September, while in Bulgaria, 329 millimeters fell in 16 hours. The storm remained slow-moving in the eastern Mediterranean for several days before its major rain bands impacted northeastern Libya on the 10th and 11th of September. Extreme rainfalls affected the coast and nearby mountains, with 414 millimeters falling in 24 hours at Al Baida on the 10th to 11th of September. The intense rainfalls resulted in extreme flooding. The most extreme impacts were in the city of Derna, which is 50 kilometers east of Al Baida, where much of the central city was destroyed by flooding that was exacerbated by the failure of 2 dams. 4,700 confirmed deaths in Libya alone have been attributed to this flooding. 8,000 people are still missing as of December 15th when this report was made. There were 19 additional deaths in Bulgaria and Greece. Tropical Cyclone Freddy in February and March was one of the world's longest-lived cyclones. It formed on the 6th of February off the coast of Australia, and after earlier landfalls in Madagascar and Mozambique, it made its final landfall again in Mozambique on the 11th of March before moving inland as a remnant low. That's over a month. This cyclone, and that, by cyclone I mean tropical cyclone, I mean hurricane. The major impacts of Hurricane Freddy were because of flooding, both in Malawi and Mozambique, as extremely heavy rainfall fell with 672 millimeters recorded in Mozambique. Parts of Malawi and Mozambique had not yet recovered from the storms in 2022. So they were already hit by storms the year before and were still trying to recover. Malawi was especially hit hard. 679 deaths were reported, with 659,000 people displaced. There was a further 165 deaths in Mozambique. Tropical cyclone Mocha, I'll call it Hurricane Mocha in May, was the most intense cyclone observed in the Bay of Bengal. So, some of this is out of date because things happened in 2024, but, I'm giving you what happened up to this point, reaching a 10-peak minimum sustained wind of 115 knots. It made landfall near Bangladesh-Myanmar border on the 14th of May. It triggered 1.7 million people to be displaced from their homes across the sub-region from Sri Lanka to Myanmar and through India and Bangladesh. Bangladesh saw displacements reported in Cox's Bazar, the world's largest refugee settlement, which is home to 900,000 Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. More than 29,000 people were relocated. In total, 156 lives were lost in Myanmar. 270,000 buildings were destroyed. 63,000 displacements took place in camps, sheltering people who were already displaced from conflicts and violence. The effects of this cyclone, with an intensification of conflict and record-high food prices, severely aggravated acute food insecurity among the 3.4 million vulnerable people. The largest reported economic loss from a single event in the year 2023 was from Hurricane Otis, which hit the Pacific coast of Mexico. Otis reached hurricane intensity at 1200 Universal Time on the 24th of October, and within 15 hours intensified to a Category 5 system. This one was unbelievable. It was one of the most rapid rates of intensification ever observed in the satellite era. Shortly afterwards, it made landfall west of Acapulco with maximum sustained winds of 260 kilometers an hour, first known Category 5 landfall on the Pacific coast of Mexico. The hurricane caused widespread destruction and the surrounding areas, with $12 billion in damages, maybe 48 deaths at least, with a further 32 people were missing, mostly at sea. I'm sure that number has been resolved again. The North Island, New Zealand, suffered repeat extreme rainfall and flooding events in January and February of that year. 500 millimeters fell in parts of the North Island. Total economic losses were estimated at $8.6 billion. By far the costliest non-earthquake disaster ever to have happened in New Zealand. Heat waves happened all over in 2023. The most extreme and significant ones were in Europe and North Africa, especially in the second half of July, where they saw temperatures of 48.2 degrees in Lazuri and Jerzu, Sardinia, only 0.6 degrees Celsius below the European record that was set in Sicily in 2021. They've been keeping records in Europe for a long time. They know that this is unbelievably hot. A mean daily temperature of 32.98 was recorded at the Brera Observatory of Milan, the highest in a record dating back to 1763. We saw temperatures of 49 in July and 50.4 in Morocco and 49.2 in Algiers in the 23rd of July. The extreme heat shifted to southeast Europe in late July, and further heat waves affected central and western parts of that continent. In late August and early September, numerous locations in southern France and northern Spain and western Switzerland set records. This would explain some of that ice melt in Switzerland. Now let's get to the goods, the wildfire season in Canada. The 2023 wildfire season in Canada was beyond anything we ever saw before, with significant activity beginning in April, expanded during a very warm and dry May, and continued throughout the summer and into early autumn. The total area burned nationally for the year was 14.9 million hectares. This is more than 7 times the long-term average and far above the previous record of 6.7 million hectares in 1989. The deadliest wildfire of the year occurred in Hawaii on the western side of the island of Maui. Extreme fire weather conditions with low humidity and strong gusty winds that were driven by a pressure gradient between high pressure to the north and the circulation of Hurricane Dora to the south, combined with pre-existing drought, continued to favor the development and rapid spread of intense fires. The most affected regions were around Lahaina, which was virtually destroyed with 2,200 structures lost. Long-term drought persisted in Africa. The Greater Horn of Africa, experiencing long-term drought, then suffered substantial flooding. All this has socioeconomic impacts. This impacts the poorest people, always. This is driving food security problems. This is driving the cost of food up. No one wants to talk about this. You're blaming the carbon tax for the cost of food going up, but we're seeing environmental disasters and weather events have significant impacts on crops and infrastructure again and again and again, creating global food shortages, insecurity for foods, populations that are having to move are being displaced without access to clean water and food, with Sudan seeing exceptional flooding, 7.8 million people, that's almost 2/3 of the south of Sudan, were exposed to severe food insecurity. Afghanistan was dry, had a bad crop season, aggravated food security there. 15.3 million Afghans were estimated to have faced food shortages. 53% of the people in Yemen were already classified as in a crisis level, and that worsened. High food and fuel prices, together with floods from March to September, that protracted conflict and further aggravated food security in the region. 645,000 tons of rice was predicted to have been decreased that year. 650,000 tons of less rice for Indonesia, but the world as well, who eats so much Indonesian rice. Record maize production in Brazil compensated for below average harvests and prolonged dry spells elsewhere. South America and Argentina, where drought conditions were expected to result in 15% decrease in cereal population production. So we saw less food being produced there, less food being produced in Haiti. The return of El Nino and led to adverse consequences for the maize cycle in Central America and South America. Water deficits and high temperatures curtailed both planting and yields, compounding negative impacts in final production. Oceania experienced the sharpest annual reduction rate in cereal production with a 31% decline. Storm Daniel in Libya flooded 3,000 hectares of cropland. It goes on and on like this. 3.4 million refugees in Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arab Republic were needing critical assistance to cope with extreme winter conditions in 2023. There's a jet stream going up and down, because the cold chasing the hot. That means the jet stream go up and down. That means global warming does result in major winter events, and people refuse to accept that because they think that they're clever. Oh, it's snow. I guess there's no such thing as global warming. Ha ha ha. You're so fucking smart. Look at the number of people, 2.4 million displaced by storm. Here, 531,000 Somalia. You look at some of these numbers, they're staggering. These are people with their lives, and as we say, let's crack down on the borders, we're creating a situation on planet Earth where vast areas are uninhabitable, where war and conflict and lack of food and water and access to health care of any kind are making people want to leave. The West, the rich countries have been reaping this for years. We're the ones that created this global instability. We're the ones that are creating the climate instability. They're the ones that are having to suffer the worst effects from it. And then when they want to go somewhere where they have a chance, where there's better weather, better climate, better government, we build walls and say, no, you can't go. It's crazy. September 24 was the second warmest September on record for the globe in the NOAA's 175-year record. This is important. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. These are the guys that are giving you all this great data on what's going on for climate change, showing how September was the second on record, where it was particularly warm, where it was particularly cool, who had average weather. So we got pretty good average, pretty good understanding on here as to why some areas, and say Eastern Canada, saw warmer. The North saw warmer. Here in BC, it wasn't too bad in September. We see lots of anomalies that show who had warmer and who had cooler. We have a pretty good idea that this was the second warmest September. We have a whole set of data here on which areas experienced what kind of above and below average temperatures. And pretty much, one of the only areas that you see below really are Iceland. Iceland is some of the only places that saw below average temperatures, on the whole throughout the entire month of September. Telling, very telling. So where is the rage? Where is the anger? Even amongst those of you who already know this, you know what's going on, a lot of you. Most of you are still watching at this point because you agree and believe. You believe that the data is being taken accurately, that this is true stuff that we're looking at. You know it is. That's why you're still here. Where's your anger? We're watching it all burn. And still you have the Democrats are running like Kamala. She's like, we're all in this together and everything's good and happy. Bullshit. It's not. Things are really, really bad. And we have a large movement of people who violently are trying to make sure that any attempt to curtail the economic destruction and environmental destruction and social and human destruction this will cause, they're doing everything they can to say, no, we're not taking responsibility. No, we're not going to change. No, we're too selfish. We're too comfortable. We're too happy, and attack anybody and anything. So why would the Trump administration's 2025 agenda have the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration on their radar, on their crosshairs for who they want to attack, deregulate, privatize, get rid of the data? Because this data stands in the way of their crazy march to wealth. People like Elon Musk, the billionaires. There's an agenda set by billionaires that doesn't serve any of you any good. One of my mentors in life is John Clark, who used to be part of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. He was the lead organizer, the founder of it. He's got some great stuff here. He says in his new article, which is called Climate and Class Struggle, as climate impacts intensify, those who face the worst consequences and those who are being abandoned in the face of them will have to struggle to survive. They will need to advance demands and develop strategies and forms of organization to confront those with economic and political power. The climate issue will be placed at the heart of the class struggle in country after country. A just and rational society would take urgent measures to curtail carbon emissions and transition to sustainable forms of economic activity. It would cooperation and solidarity do this. It would take measures that were deemed necessary to minimize the impacts on the global population. But you can't expect any of these responses under the present system. In his book, Capitalism in the Anthropocene, Ecological Ruin or Ecological Revolution, John Bellamy Foster argues that capitalism's competitive drive to generate profits and accumulate wealth is at odds with creating a viable relationship with the natural world. He suggests we face an irrational system of artificially stimulated growth, economic waste, financialized wealth, and extreme inequality that threatens our very existence. The evidence to support such a view is wide-ranging and abundant. The escalating impacts of the climate crisis are to be found in the greatly increased levels of extreme heat, devastating droughts, violent storms, wildfires, and floods. The appalling failure to act in the face of these catastrophic impacts is even more compelling reason to draw anti-capitalist conclusions. In 2024, The Guardian reported that in June, the world's consumption of fossil fuels climbed to a record high last year, driving emissions to 40 gigatons of CO2 for the first time. There is, moreover, nothing at all accidental about such a terrible development. Shell CEO Wal Sawan responded to a question about renewable energy sources. He was very forthright and honest. He said, "We'll drive for strong returns in any business we go into. Our shareholders deserve to see us going after strong returns. Absolutely, we want to continue to go for lower and lower carbon, but it has to be profitable." The conclusion that fundamental social change is necessary is absolutely vital, but we must ask ourselves how to organize to make a difference in the society at present in this dangerous moment we have. The first and obvious consideration to do all we can to stay the destructive hand of fossil fuel companies, banks, and other interests that have set us on the present path to environmental catastrophe. We must develop and apply forms of mass action that can lead to the curtailing of emissions and transition to renewable energy sources. We are hardly starting from nowhere because a vital struggle for climate justice is already well underway. It's a basic point of agreement, John Clark argues, that's essential is that capitalist interests and political power structures must be faced with mass resistance and determined challenges if they're forced to make any concessions to change anything. Those who think they can win meaningful change by dialoguing with these leaders and fossil fuel lobbyists at climate summits are mistaken. We may reasonably conclude that a social and economic system that willfully compounds a planetary climate disaster is unlikely to place any more emphasis on keeping the mass of people safe in the face of that disaster than it is compelled to do so. All that lies between us and social abandonment is our ability to challenge those in power with sufficient strength and determination to ensure our demands are met. Faced with very major climate impacts in the workplace, we'll give you some good examples here. The Justice for Migrant Workers in Southern Ontario is demanding the government of the province implement emergency measures to protect farm workers from extreme heat. Farm workers are 35 times more likely than the rest of the population to die of heat exposure. The International Labour Organization says that 2.4 billion workers out of a global workforce of 3.4 billion are likely to be exposed to excessive heat at some point during their work. Meanwhile, though, people like Ron DeSantis in Florida passed a measure that bans local governments from requiring heat and water breaks for outdoor workers. Florida is a state that experiences a great deal of hot weather, where construction and farming are huge industries. Not allowed to have heat breaks. Extreme weather, floods, wildfires will produce levels of destruction and dislocation that will involve major job losses and chronic impacts such as drought. They'll have huge economic impacts, and that will impact the poorest people. The situation that's developing requires that most comprehensive plans and measures be put in place to deal with extreme weather and chronic effects of climate change. UK's Climate Change Committee warned in May 2024 that the country is absolutely lacking in climate adaptation measures. People aren't ready for what a disaster might do. We don't have emergency planning to deal with disasters effectively in place. So these disasters keep happening and people are like, oh no, a disaster's happening. Assume a disaster is going to happen and start planning for it. In 2022, Pakistan was hit by the worst flooding in living memory. 33 million people lost their homes, their crops were destroyed, or they lost their jobs. 33 million. 1 year after the floods, researchers from Islamic Relief who talked to people in the flood-affected areas found 40% of the children they surveyed had stunted growth. 25% were underweight as families struggled to access food and health care. Yet it's the countries of the global south that are crushed by debt. They're largely owe their money to institutions and banks that are based in the rich countries. Last December, as reported, the world's poorest countries were having to allocate 38% of government revenues to debt servicing, 54% in the cases of African countries. Pakistan's acute debt crisis has staved off $7 billion loan. This will buy its government a bit of time, but in return, the IMF will require more commitments to impose austerity measures on the impoverished population. The country's malnourished children will stay hungry so that the bankers in the West can be paid off. The UN Refugee Agency estimated that between 2008 and 2016, 21.5 million people were forcibly displaced each year by weather-related events. That's an average. It also suggests 1.2 billion people could be displaced globally by 2050 due to climate change and natural disasters. We see racist border enforcement and other measures being employed to try and exclude those driven by poverty and destabilization to seek safety in Western countries. In the years ahead, we'll see millions of climate refugees struggling for survival in this way, as portions of the earth become effectively uninhabitable. In such a catastrophic situation, the response to this forced movement of people must be just and viable on an international scale. It becomes clear with every passing month that the climate and class struggle are inextricably linked. Capitalism's inability to create sustainable relationship with the natural world is having devastating and rapidly worsening consequences for the bulk of humanity, but also the creatures and plants and animals and all things on Earth. Left to their own devices, those with economic and political power won't address the factors that are driving the crisis or deal properly with the now inevitable climate impacts. The class struggle that we take up now must be based on an active solidarity for survival and the goal of a rational and just society. In the face of the existential crisis that we are now confronting, there is simply no other way forward.